The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, en politique comme dans la vie, on n'a qu'une seule parole. Alors moi, je vais prendre la balle au bon et je vais vous lire la page 282 du budget en anglais, parce que c'est à ça qu'elle vient de référer. Et vous saurez, comme tous les Canadiens qui nous écoutent, si oui ou non, la page 282 du budget parle de la loi sur la protection des zones navigables. Oui ou non? In life, as in politics, everything revolves around whether we have credibility. So, the member just spoke and told us that on page 282 of the budget, we would find a reference to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. I will now read page 282 of the budget. Transport portfolio. Organizations in the transport portfolio identified a combination of productivity-enhanced and transformative measures that change the way programs and services are delivered and support the government's agenda of refocusing government and reducing red tape. I ask you to retain that word. I ask you to retain that term because in their mouths, reducing red tape is synonymous with reducing public protection. Walkerton, XL Foods, listeriosis, reducing public protection. That's a theme we're going to talk a lot about this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. So let's continue. Non-core activities will be reduced while maintaining capacity related to core mandates in order to protect the safety of Canadians and support economic growth. For example, Air Canada Inc. will pursue productivity improvements such as augmenting the performance of the heating, ventilation and air conditioning systems. Navigable Waters Protection Act?
Not yet.
Not so far.
Not yet. Not yet.
Onboard trains to reduce maintenance costs, reduce energy consumption and increase passenger comfort. It will also implement automation projects such as electronic ticketing and invoicing systems. Navigable water? I haven't heard it. Planned savings, transport portfolio. Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. Now this is kind of interesting, because this is where they start cutting, like they cut the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, where they cut things that directly protect Canadians' health and safety. Here we have cuts ongoing of $59.7 million. We have Marine Atlantic, the Jacques Cartier and Champlain Bridges Incorporated, cuts. Champlain Bridge is about to fall down, but they're going to cut.
Good.
Transport Canada, Rail Canada. Note, there is a note at the bottom of the page. The government is committed to balance air travel security expenses with air traveler security charge revenues over time. Totals may not add due to rounding. Now, you might have noticed that there was no reference in there to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. Wow. There's no reference whatsoever in there to the Navigable Waters Protection Act.
Read that in.
Well, what's up? What's up is this. On the website of the Transport Department, under the heading Navigable Waters Protection Act, we've got a summary of what that centennial legislation does. It's groundbreaking. It's a model for the world of how to protect the environment.
Right.
Canada has literally millions of lakes and tens of thousands of rivers. It is constitutionally the purview, the responsibility, the obligation of the federal government, specifically in the Constitution Act 1867, to care for navigable and floatable waters. Let's look at some of the wording. This is straight from the website. By the way, this website was changed last night after my colleague, the member from Halifax, raised it yesterday afternoon. This is pure Orwellian. They make things disappear when it doesn't agree with the version they've decided to concoct and invent. The Navigable Waters Protection Act minimizes the interference of navigation on navigable waters throughout Canada. It ensures a balance between public right to navigate and the need to build works such as bridges, dams, docks, or navigable waters. With this goal in mind, the Navigable Waters Protection Act prohibits the throwing or depositing of any materials into navigable waters. That stops you from polluting waters in Canada. Sounds like environmental protection to me, Mr. Speaker, but obviously the member has never quite gotten to read the Act. It's there. It's one of the statutes of Canada. just so she can find it. It's an alphanumeric, works with the alphabet. She should be able to find it. N22. What is substantial interference? The application. This approval process is usually longer, requiring you to complete additional steps, including advertising the proposed project to the public and undertaking an environmental assessment in accordance with the requirements of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Another act that they are destroying with their budget, no mention. But in the Budget Implementation Act, as they did in the spring with C-38, they're destroying it again. They're removing environmental assessments in Canada. We're going to go from thousands of environmental assessments every year in Canada to a couple of dozen. That's because it's a preordained result. They started making the mistake in Energy Project. They were no longer referring to the environmental assessment process. They were talking about the approval process. It was a slip of the tongue, but it was really revealing. The Supreme Court of Canada, in the Old Man Dam case, made it abundantly clear, it was a decision by Judge Lemaire on behalf of the court, made it abundantly clear that there was no possibility of building a project like that unless you respected the environment. That was a landmark case in Canada, and it was based on the Navigable Waters Protection Act. So it's so incredibly mind-numbing to hear their Minister of Transport stand up and say, the Navigable Waters Protection Act's never had anything to do with the environment. It's to do with navigation. It's unbelievable. It has protected watercourses throughout our history. It is a model for the world, and it is being destroyed, and it was never in the budget. Mr. Speaker, I listened to some of the economic theories of the government. This week in the Hill Times, a reputable publication if there is one, the expert economist David Crane published an interesting paper entitled "Resources are important, but they're not enough." And it's worth going through the words of Mr. Crane. It says, the strongest economy is one that is well diversified both in its sources of economic growth and in its markets. Ignoring the need for a vibrant, advanced manufacturing industry and high-value knowledge-based services, as well as a resource sector that upgrades its output in Canada, is a recipe for disaster. He goes on to look chapter and verse through all of the things that the member who just spoke bragged about as being their economic theory, and dismantles it. Shows that what we've been saying for years now, that Canada is losing the balanced economy that we had painstakingly built up since the Second World War. We're losing an economy that had, of course, a strong and vibrant resource sector, a primary sector that includes agriculture and fishery, but it also had a diverse and strong manufacturing sector and, of course, a service sector. Since the Conservatives came to power, we've lost hundreds of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs, jobs that came with enough of a salary for a family to live on, more often than not came with a pension. Those jobs are being replaced by part-time, precarious work in the service sector, and more importantly, no pension. Because in addition to the environmental debt that we're leaving in the backpacks of future generations, the one I just described, allowing companies to use our air, our soil, and our water as an unlimited free dumping ground, we're also leaving a social debt. Because when those people come to retirement without enough to live on, who's going to pick up the tab? The next generation. If we allow them to continue, we will become the first generation in Canadian history to leave less to the next generation than what we ourselves receive. We will not let that happen. Now, the last time the Conservatives took to shoving one of their omnibus bills down the throats of Canadians, it was Bill C-38 last spring. Donc ça, c'est la continuation d'une œuvre commencée par les conservateurs le printemps dernier. De notre part, une fois qu'ils ont commencé et qu'on s'est rendu compte que des douzaines de différentes lois allaient être affectées, puis les droits des Canadiens, notamment le droit des générations futures, allaient être négativement affectés, on a essayé d'utiliser les outils à notre disposition comme parlementaires. Mais vous savez, on était face à une situation sans précédent dans l'histoire du Parlement canadien. Ce qui n'est pas sans précédent, c'est d'avoir une majorité. En fait, c'était la norme jusqu'à tout récemment d'avoir des gouvernements majoritaires. Ce qui était nouveau, c'était d'avoir un gouvernement tellement arrogant, tellement pas à l'écoute de la population, qu'ils pensaient qu'ils étaient comme des empereurs. Ils n'avaient besoin de personne, ils n'avaient plus besoin de parler avec qui que ce soit. C'est le nom même du Parlement. On est censé être ici pour être entendu. J'ai entendu la députée de Saint-Boniface qui a parlé tantôt dire, en réponse à une question, « N'avez-vous pas entendu parler de la récession globale? » Moi, je lui rappelle amicalement que c'est son ministre des Finances qui, en plein milieu de cette même crise mondiale, à l'automne 2008, qui niait la réalité de la récession globale et refusait d'agir. Quelle arrogance incarnée! Leur manque total de priorité fait en sorte qu'au lieu de tailler avec un bistouri dans l'État lorsque besoin est, ils y vont avec une machette rouillée. Ils n'ont jamais défini des priorités pour une bonne et simple raison, c'est qu'ils sont très contents d'être au pouvoir, ça ils aiment, mais ils n'aiment pas gouverner. Voilà. C'est quoi la distinction? Ben, l'un, c'est le fait même d'occuper la majorité des fauteuils dans cette place. L'autre exige une compétence en administration publique dans l'intérêt de la population et pas dans l'intérêt des copains du régime conservateur. Voilà. Absence totale de priorité. 450 pages dans cette plus récente mouture, 64 lois différentes affectées, dont 20, et on vient de faire la démonstration que la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables n'est même pas mentionnée dans le budget. 20 de ces projets de loi, pas juste la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables, 19 autres ne sont même pas mentionnés dans le budget du printemps dernier. Je disais au départ que c'est une question de crédibilité pour le gouvernement. Alors, regardons quelques-uns des faits comme ça. Regardons quelques exemples de leur administration publique et étudions-le à l'aune de ce qu'on doit comprendre comme étant des priorités d'administration publique. What could be more important than protecting the health and indeed the lives of Canadians? If we look at the whole pyramid of public administration, it exists to provide ultimately one thing, a service to the public, and what services could be more important than public protection? What is in the budget bill is a $46.6 million cut to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. That's in here word for word. Yeah, well, they talk about things that are not in here, but I'm talking about things that are in here, and this is at page 261. It's in there. Well, you know, one of the brilliant members of the Peanut Gallery has just asked a question that I'm pleased to respond to, Mr. Speaker, because his question was, is there a carbon tax in there? Now, that's interesting because where you will find a cap-and-trade system proposed is in the 2008 platform of the Conservative Party. Can't be. What's interesting is that in 2008, the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, went to the mother of all parliaments and told the parliamentarians there that it was his plan to have a cap-and-trade system.
He said that out loud.
Now, he even put a price on carbon, Mr. Speaker.
He put a price.
He put a $65 a ton price on carbon in front of the Parliament. Now,
that's a lot of money.
Far be it from us to think for a second that in the mother of all parliaments he was telling the mother of all fibs, so let's take him at his word. If we look, and in 2008 it was actually a little bit less, but if we take the figure for 2008, at $65 a ton. You know what that equates to in Canada?
No idea.
About $45 billion.
Holy mackerel. That's a lot of money.
If we were in the same business as the brilliant and talented member who just spoke from the netherworlds of the backbenches of the Conservatives, we would be able to argue that that was a carbon tax of $45 billion. But you know what?
No.
That wouldn't be quite true.
That's right.
Because it was a cap-and-trade system, and it was the only way of dealing with greenhouse gases. In the quote that she gave, the member for St. Boniface quoted a newspaper writer who talked about so-called greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, very good.
Now that is quite something, because it betrays a fundamental belief of the troglodytes that somehow greenhouse gases are something that you believe in. They don't really exist. There's no such thing, really, as far as the Conservatives are concerned, as global warming. It's just something that's being made up to scare people. Or, in the unforgettable words of the Conservative Prime Minister when he was describing the Kyoto Protocol, he said it was something that was invented to suck money from rich countries. There was no such thing as global warming. No action was needed. And you can just hear them. They're saying, here, here. There you go. They're excited. You know, greenhouse gas, I'd like to know how much greenhouse gas emissions come from suntan salons, for example. Maybe we could reduce those as well, Mr. Speaker. Their tactics, 450 pages, 64 separate acts, 20 that were never in the budget, allow for no study, no accountability, no consultation with Canadians affected, no respect for Canadians who deserve better. The basic job of every person elected to this House is to make sure public money is being well spent.
Exactly.
Make sure legislation is rational, well thought out. That's our job.
Exactly.
We've given ourselves institutions to help ourselves do that. We've got, for example, under the Parliament of Canada Act, we now have a parliamentary budget officer who has the legal right to receive all financial information so that he can inform our debates in the public interest. They boast about the fact that they brought it in their Responsibility Act. They've never obeyed it, any more than they've obeyed the fixed dates for elections. This is the art of being a Conservative. You stand on a soapbox, you announce what you're going to do, and then you do the exact opposite. They are denying what is written in Canadian law. They are going against the will of Parliament. They are frustrating the ability of the parliamentary budget officer to do the job that he was asked to do, indeed mandated to do by law in the public interest, simply because he has stood up to them time and again. He refuses to be another one of their marionettes and parrot lines written for him by the Prime Minister's office. Of course, for that, he must be punished as far as they're concerned. Conservatives are using omnibus legislation to sneak hundreds of changes to these different acts past Canadians, and we won't let them do it. Ils sont en train de faire des coupures dans la plus récente mouture de la loi Mammouth, des coupures, par exemple, pour des différentes commissions et organismes qui ont été mises en place pour assurer une plus grande responsabilité, imputabilité, et ça continue une tendance lourde déjà commencée au printemps. On est en train de concentrer les pouvoirs dans les mains des différents ministres et ministères. For example, they're eliminating the Hazardous Materials Information Review Commission. It helped protect workers from hazardous materials in the workplace. That is not something that they had talked about in the budget. It is going to have an effect on workers' lives. We will stand up and fight this every step of the way. They're repealing the Grain Appeals Tribunal. Now, this is interesting because this actually helped producers by giving them a right of appeal when they had been given a grade for their wheat and they didn't agree with it. So this is the same government that said that they were going to scrap the wheat board. There was never any logical reason for it. And they went ahead, and one of the ministers from Winnipeg saying that they did scrap it. Unfortunately for him, he's going off his talking points because the talking point is not that they scrapped it, it's that they made it better. But he's just telling us that they did scrap it. Oopsie. More reading for the suntan salon. They dissolved the Canada EI Financing Board, leaving the Employment Insurance account $9 billion in deficit. And the Cabinet takes even more power to rule on environmental assessments and pipelines, even while firing scientists who give them expert advice. Now, this, of course, is the government that decided during the summer that they were the new church of conservative scientists. You remember them during the summer. They told us that from now on, they had decided that they were going to believe in science. So how did they prove that? Well, they fired most of the scientists in the government because who needed them anymore? They were now the scientists. And the ones that they didn't fire, they muzzled. They're getting rid of things like the experimental lakes area, which is the only place on planet Earth where you can study whole lake ecosystems. They're scrapping it. And what do we get from their famous... They have an imitator at the other end. You know, he's constantly imitating the newscaster who's given documents to read, doesn't even know what's in them. He stands up and tells us, time and time again, that there's really no problem with the experimental lakes area. He's saying as long as somebody is willing to buy it, it can continue. Can you imagine? How are you supposed to have government scientists doing science in an area that belongs to all Canadians if it's sold to private interests? That's the road that they want to take us down. So our very own Ron Burgundy stands up time and time again, reads whatever is put in front of him by the Prime Minister's office, doesn't even know what's written on his piece of paper, doesn't realize how absurd it is. He's the same person who now believes that Canada is in a situation to actually reduce greenhouse gases and meet its undertakings under international agreements. Nothing could be further from the truth. They will not be able to meet any of those obligations because they don't even have a plan to meet them. Quand on regarde la sécurité du public, Monsieur le Président, il existe, comme je le mentionnais tout à l'heure, une pyramide d'administration publique et qui existe pour faire justement une chose, assurer la protection du public. Donc, quand il faut couper, la toute dernière chose qu'il faut toucher, c'est le service direct au public. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on voit à la place? Qu'est-ce que j'étais en train de vous démontrer tantôt? Ils sont en train de couper dans la sécurité des aliments, 47 millions de dollars. Ils sont en train de couper dans la sécurité aérienne, plus de 100 millions de dollars. Ils sont en train de couper les centres de ressources pour le sauvetage en mer. On parle littéralement de sauver des vies et ils sont en train de couper là-dedans. Demandez aux gens à Québec, demandez aux gens à Kitsilano qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent de cet effort-là. Ils coupent la garde côtière, ils coupent la sécurité aux frontières. Ça, c'est des choses qui nous intéressent au plus haut point. Vous avez eu l'occasion plus tôt aujourd'hui d'entendre mon collègue de Compton Stansted lorsqu'il a décrit exactement ce qui est en train de se passer à la frontière chez lui. C'est ça, ne pas avoir de priorité. C'est ça, ne rien comprendre de l'administration publique. J'ai écouté les fantaisies, les fabulations de la députée de Saint-Boniface tout à l'heure, où elle faisait une pastiche imaginaire de ce qu'elle projetait comme étant notre manière de procéder en administration publique. Quand nous, on compare l'expérience dans cette pièce, dans l'opposition officielle, avec le débâcle du F-35, où on n'a jamais pris la peine de définir les besoins du Canada, on n'a jamais procédé à un appel d'offres, on n'a jamais déterminé qui était le plus bas soumissionnaire conforme, et on a dépensé jusqu'à date 700 millions de dollars pour un appareil qui ne rencontre même pas les besoins du Canada. On sait de quel côté de la pièce il y a des gens compétents. C'est certainement pas eux autres. C'est une gang d'incompétents. Leur incurie est innommable et on va les remplacer en 2020. So this week, as 1.3 million pounds of contaminated, tainted meat were being dumped into an Alberta landfill, that's a good legacy. The same minister who 4 years ago told lame jokes about death by 1,000 cold cuts as 23 Canadians died because he had not done his job of putting in place a competent food inspection system. Who was the minister? The same minister. And when the opposition unanimously called for his resignation, who stood up and voted for him and defended him? The Prime Minister. Exactly. This is no longer a question of the incompetent Minister of Agriculture. Exactly. It's a question of the Prime Minister who's endangering public safety by allowing him to stay in place. Le ministre de l'Agriculture se lave les mains et dit ben, c'est pas moi qui ai fait les inspections. Voilà. Ça, c'est la gang qui nous rabâche les oreilles à tous les jours avec la reine, avec le mot royal, avec la monarchie. Alors, s'ils sont si nostalgiques que ça pour la reine, ils devraient penser aux autres institutions parlementaires, justement en Angleterre, où la règle de base du système parlementaire britannique, c'est l'imputabilité ministérielle. Voilà. C'est lui qui est responsable, pas l'inspecteur, parce que c'est lui qui n'a pas fait sa job de veiller à ce que les inspecteurs protègent le public. C'est lui qui devrait partir. C'est lui qui porte la responsabilité. He knew about the safety violations at XL Foods. He knew the company was withholding testing data. He knew the Americans had deemed the plant unsafe. In fact, we would have never known about any of this if it hadn't been for the Americans doing their job of inspecting the meat at the border. Good thing we have the American inspectors as whistleblowers. It took him 2 more weeks to sound the alarm after the Americans already knew. Budget cuts, $46.6 million, 300 positions cut. That's in the budget. Absolutely. Unlike the fantasy about the Navigable Waters Protection Act, that's in the budget. 300 positions cut at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Public protection endangered. Canadian lives endangered. That's in the budget, Mr. Speaker. He dares point at others, point at the inspectors and say that it's their fault. Here's where the fault lies. Instead of enforcing legislation in the public interest, instead of doing as the Americans do, going in and enforcing, what they do is they have a self-reporting system. Maybe that's where they got their marks in university. They gave themselves their own marks. They reported their own results to their teachers. Maybe that's what it is. Because it's the only way to explain it, because you don't ask the person you're supposed to be enforcing and inspecting to tell you whether or not they're actually doing it. What you do with public money is you send in inspectors, you check them, you enforce, you regulate in the public interest. The result is a hit for our farmers, our producers. It's a hit for public confidence in our food system. Everyone loses because they're not doing their jobs. Malgré 50 ans de croissance économique dans notre pays, le Premier ministre nous ferait croire maintenant que les institutions, les services, les programmes sur lesquels on s'est fié depuis des générations sont soudainement devenus trop chers. On ne peut plus se les permettre. Il y a un lien entre le fait qu'ils n'arrêtent pas de couper la capacité fiscale de l'État et le fait qu'ils prescrivent maintenant comme solution de couper les services. Mais à la base, on a une croissance économique constante, on a des institutions qui reflètent le meilleur en nous-mêmes, et ces institutions sont en danger à cause de leur incurie, leur incompétence. Et regardez juste une statistique pour le fun. 33 milliards de dollars, ça c'est les profits cette année de nos quelques banques à Chartres. C'est un quasi-monopole, c'est un oligopole, c'est pas besoin d'être brillant pour se taper les bretelles pour dire on est extraordinaire. Il y a juste quelques banques au Canada. Elles ont un monopole, puis elles peuvent charger ce qu'elles veulent comme taux d'intérêt. C'est n'importe quoi de dire que c'est des grands génies du marché privé. 33 milliards de dollars, c'est exactement 1 000 $ par homme, femme et enfant au Canada comme profit. Chaque femme, homme et enfant au Canada donne 1 000 $ de profit à nos banques à Chartres chaque année. C'est désordonné, Monsieur le Président. il y a des institutions qui définissent qui nous sommes comme nation. We're so proud that the NDP under Tommy Douglas was responsible for bringing free, universal, public, portable, and accessible medical care to this country. We don't think that any Canadian family should ever have to choose between having a sick child seen by a doctor and being able to put groceries on the table. And you know what? I honestly believe that there are more things that we have in common as individuals than the partisanship on the other side would have you believe. Because I honestly believe that the vast majority of the people who sit across from me in the government benches agree that it's a good thing that we don't have an American-style system, that it's a good thing that as Canadians we take care of each other. And at the beginning I was saying that's why it's so important to look at the gulf that separates the words of the Conservatives and their actions. Because, you know, in the summer, in June of 2011, shortly after we formed the official opposition, there were a couple of the last questions that he asked in this House. Jack Layton asked two very specific questions of the Prime Minister. One was, are you going to cut health care? The answer, categorical, it's answered, it's easy to go check. We will not be reducing transfers for health care. In December of the same year, barely a few months later, during a meeting with his provincial counterparts, the Minister of Finance, over lunch, wasn't even an agenda item, sometime between his coffee and his apple pie, looked over the table and said, by the way, I'm removing $36 billion from the projected and budgeted health care transfers from the feds to the provinces. No negotiation, no debate, no discussion, straight diktat from the federal government to the provinces. That's their way. That's not our way.
Here.
The other question that Jack Layton asked on June 7th, 8th to the Prime Minister had to do with pensions. And this is what I would call in French un demi-vérité, ou encore plus un demi-mensonge. Because it's an art that they master. It's around, for example, the F-35, because you'll hear the Minister of Defense often go to his microphone and say, not one penny has been spent on F-35 acquisitions.
The Parliamentary Secretary is rising on a point of order.
I'm sorry to interrupt because I hate to do points of order, but I would allow the member opposite, the leader of the official opposition, to withdraw his comment about a half lie. That is unparliamentary language. He knows it. He ought to abide by the rules. And I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, to enforce the rules by asking him to withdraw that unparliamentary comment.
I believe that all honourable members are familiar with the rules of this place, and I would ask all honourable members to avoid non-parliamentary language. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. All you have to do is listen to the Minister of Defense. When he stands up on the F-35s, they've spent $700 million to date, and then he stands up and he says, not one penny has been spent on the F-35
What do you guys call that?
acquisition. He just adds the... Of course, you can't acquire it. It doesn't exist yet. There's only a papier-mâché version that he uses for press conferences. That's the type of thing that they have started to master. When the government responded, when the Prime Minister responded to Jack Layton's specific question, are you going to cut pensions? His hand on his heart, the Prime Minister stood up and said, we will not be cutting pensions. Wow. When they added 2 more years and took $13,000 out of the pockets of 5 million old-age security recipients, you know what the Minister of Finance had the temerity to stand up and say? Oh, we said we wouldn't touch pensions. We never said we wouldn't touch old-age security. Rimshot. This is the Conservative way. As if the amount of money that you get to live on after retirement wasn't generically the pension for the average Canadian. That's unbelievable hypocrisy. There are certain measures of the civilization that you live in, of the society that you live in. In a country as rich as Canada, it is unthinkable that we have hundreds of thousands of elderly who have worked all their lives living in poverty. We will change that. How is it possible that after 900 pages of budget bills, we're not doing anything to deal with situations like the third world conditions in places like Attawapiskat? How is it possible in a country as rich as Canada that we still allow those third world conditions to continue?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary is rising on another point of order.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I really am someone who hates to do points of order, but I need to understand very clearly the official opposition leader said the word demi-mensonge. Is it the ruling of the Speaker that that is in fact unparliamentary? If it is, the member must withdraw or apologize. I'm just asking for clarification. I don't want to interrupt again, but he needs to do the right thing if that is the ruling of the chair.
I appreciate the point of order from the Parliamentary Secretary, and as I said a few minutes ago, I would urge all honourable members to avoid non-parliamentary message. There is a practice in this House that there are certain words that are clearly avoided and are not acceptable. There are others that are in a grey area in terms of whether they are direct or indirect. In my view, in this case, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition did not cross that line, but he was in that area, and so I would ask all honourable members to obey the rules as they are commonly practiced in this place. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci pour votre détermination à cet égard-là. Tout en vous rappelant que cette plaignardise vient de celle qui nous a dirigés vers le page 282 du budget tout à l'heure, affirmant que ça parlait de la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables, alors qu'il n'en est rien. Les changements dans le budget changent les règles du jeu pour l'enseignante, l'ingénieur. On est en train de dire en termes d'assurance-emploi que dorénavant, on va être obligé de conduire jusqu'à 1 heure pour aller se trouver un emploi, sinon on va perdre nos prestations d'assurance-emploi. La menace aux industries qui dépendent des emplois saisonniers est incroyable. Comment est-ce que vous êtes censé faire si vous travaillez dans le domaine de la pêche, en Canada Atlantique par exemple? Comment est-ce que vous êtes censé faire? Si la ministre est en train d'exiger que dorénavant, vous devriez vous expatrier, ce n'est pas quelqu'un qui peut se former en 5 heures ou 5 jours ou même 5 mois. Ça prend plusieurs saisons pour former quelqu'un pour travailler sur un bateau. On est en train de vider déjà ces communautés de leurs forces vives à cause du dollar artificiellement élevé. Toutes nos industries d'exportation souffrent terriblement. C'est en train de se faire ressentir, notamment en Canada Atlantique, et au lieu d'aider. Gouverner, c'est comprendre aussi le pays, les différences régionales, les besoins régionaux différents. Plutôt que de s'accommoder à ça, on est en train d'appliquer la même médecine partout. On est en train de s'attaquer à des régions qui avaient rudement besoin d'un bon coup de main. Au lieu de ça, ils sont en train de recevoir un coup de poing. Voilà. C'est ça, des conservateurs. On est en train, par ailleurs, Monsieur le Président, de créer une économie où les salaires vont être beaucoup moins élevés, et c'est une pression à la baisse de toutes les conditions d'emploi par une série de mesures qui sont en train d'être prises. Ce n'est pas du hasard que pour la première fois de notre histoire, la classe moyenne a vu ses revenus chuter. En clair, et c'est concomitant avec la signature de l'ALENA. Depuis les 25 dernières années, la classe moyenne a vu ses revenus nets réels diminuer. Première fois que ça arrive. En d'autres mots, les premiers 20%, les mieux nantis, sont en train de voir leur revenu augmenter, Les autres 80 mesurés, prouvés, sont en train de voir leur revenu diminuer. Ça, c'est le fruit des politiques néoconservatrices du gouvernement actuel et de leurs émules dans le Parti libéral qui ont poursuivi rigoureusement les mêmes buts depuis 25 ans. Ça exerce une pression à la baisse sur les revenus, sur les conditions d'emploi. Et comme si ce n'était pas assez d'avoir ces ententes-là qui font ce nivellement vers le bas, dorénavant, les travailleurs étrangers temporaires qui, auparavant, venaient dans quelques industries, notamment pour travailler sur les fermes maraîchères, par exemple, dorénavant, on les retrouve dans plusieurs catégories d'emplois. Le gouvernement y crie qu'on peut les payer beaucoup moins que les Canadiens. On est en train de travailler dans les mines. On est en train de travailler dans plusieurs endroits. Et quel résultat? Allez rencontrer les métallos à Prince-Georges en Colombie-Britannique pour savoir quelle pression c'est en train d'avoir. C'est un travail dur. On travaille dur toute sa vie. On s'est battu pour avoir un revenu juste. On apprend que les conservateurs vont exiger que tu travailles 2 ans de plus avant d'avoir ta pension de retraite. Oh, puis par ailleurs, si ce n'était pas assez de pression sur toi, on va importer des travailleurs de d'autres pays, on va les payer moins, puis ça va exercer une autre pression à la baisse. Ça, c'est le Canada de rêve des conservateurs, où les travailleurs sont à pied, en train de travailler dans des conditions des années 1900. Ça, c'est leur rêve. Le Canada juste que nous, on veut construire, on a des discours lamentables comme ce qu'on a entendu tout à l'heure, comme si c'était une hérésie. Un pays aussi riche que le Canada est capable de se payer des conditions d'emploi décentes, et ça fait partie de ce qu'un gouvernement est traité C'est ça. C'est ça la succession que les conservateurs sont en train de laisser. N'oubliez pas que leur loi budgétaire du printemps, le C-38, abrogeait la loi sur les salaires justes. Don't forget, Bill C-38, their budget bill in the spring, repealed the Fair Wages Act and the Hours of Labor Act. That's their vision. They're not attacking one particular group or sector. Their goal is to drive down wages for all Canadians. Total lack of an economic plan. The government isn't just failing workers, but businesses that create jobs too. Canada faces a perfect storm of economic challenges. 500,000 lost manufacturing jobs, a $50 billion trade deficit, household debt at an all-time high, the worst American downturn since the Great Depression, and we are still in the middle of a Eurozone crisis. When we talk to them about the interest that we have of using our experience, our expertise, and our capability to help in Europe, we get the usual talking points. Oh, you want us to write a big check to Europe? What imbecility. As if the idea of using our experience and our expertise to help avoid a crisis that will invariably negatively affect us was something wrong. And yet, those are the talking points that come out of the PMO, because they make stuff up. That's all they've got. They've got nothing else, Mr. Speaker. They make up pages in the budget. They make up pages in the budget. They make up plans for the NDP that have never existed, other than the ones that were the same ones that they had. They make stuff up all day long because they can't defend what they're actually doing. Exactly. That's what we're talking about now. What's actually in here, what they're actually doing, and the negative effect it's having on Canadians, workers across the country.
Here.
C-45. What an irony. The Jobs and Growth Act. It doesn't even contain a plan to generate either. Budget 2012 kills more jobs than it creates. It contains no strategy for the 1.4 million out-of-work Canadians. So-called centerpiece of the economic plan is the small business tax credit. You know what? You can applaud, because the NDP supports a tax credit. It was part of our 2011 platform. But this one doesn't go far enough. It's worth a maximum of $1,000, and it lasts just 1 year. At best, it may be enough to help companies hire one full-time employee. It won't even make a dent in our lagging job numbers. The truth is, this government continues its failed policy of lavish corporate tax cuts, even as companies ship jobs overseas. For example, one company demanded a 50% pay cut and shut its doors after receiving $5 million from the Conservatives. That was called Electromotive Diesel in London. I got to visit the workers on the picket line in the middle of the winter. It was an extraordinary experience because just a few months earlier, a beaming Prime Minister had been out there with a $5 million check because this was evidence of the success of his plan for jobs in Canada. As soon as that election campaign was over, there was a little meeting. The bosses sat down and said, "We got a deal for you. You accept a 50% pay cut, or we move your jobs south of the border." The company's closed. The jobs have been moved. They kept the $5 million. There's no longer any jobs in Canada. That's the Conservative plan. $5 million and want it back. 30 years ago, a young worker could work his way up a company. Now workers have many different jobs in a lifetime. The incentive to invest in workers is being lost. Large workforce is no longer a sign of pride. You know, a couple of generations ago, someone who was running a big company would be very proud, take great pride in giving you the numbers in his workforce. Now, the great pride is saying how many of those jobs you've shifted to another country. That's the change. We've got to get back to a feeling in Canada that it's a social responsibility to be proud to be creating good-paying jobs. So why do we keep doing like the Conservatives do? Investing in companies like Electromotive Diesel that don't invest in our workforce. You know, this is the type of short-sightedness that we see all over Bill C-45. Changes, for example, to the scientific research and experimental development tax credit. That program is being cut. The $500 million a year that it costs are being eliminated, but it reduces government support for business research and development at a time when businesses need to increase innovation to compete. To put it another way, if we can't get them to do the right thing because it's the right thing, let's try to get them to do the right thing because it's actually good for the economy. Right. The only way to increase wealth in our society is to increase knowledge, and this is the dumbing down of Canadian business. That's the Conservative legacy. It's going to hit manufacturing particularly hard at a time when they're the ones that need a little bit of oxygen to keep going. What we need are tailored incentives that better serve businesses and our economy as a whole. You know, there are a couple of good examples that can be looked at in Canada where long-term vision and incentive by the government has produced a great result. Look at the TV industry and the film industry in Toronto, for example. It used to be a time when it was only New York and Hollywood. Now, Toronto is in there competing with them every step of the way, but it required a partnership between government, business, and labor. Those tax incentives that were there for decades, and it's worked its way through the system, and it's producing a great result. That brings in billions a year, lots of high-quality jobs. But it required a government involvement every step of the way. They simply don't believe in that. The next success story should be being built now. Instead, we're getting less for workers, less for Canadians, less for our economy. That's what they're about, less for everyone. We're also seeing that in the business environment now, there should be the creation of a climate for growth. We have to ensure predictability, but all we have to do is look at the catastrophe this week with the sale of one of the gas companies. They can't even give the criteria on which the decision was based, and they released the decision at 11:57 p.m. on a Friday. They can't explain the decision. They have to hide it. And then when they come back into the House, they go back to the talking points and they keep referring to the statute, but the decision uses criteria that are not in the statute. So how is a foreign company looking to invest in Canada supposed to make an intelligent decision? We saw the effect on the stock market immediately on Monday. Stocks were getting pummeled. People don't know. This is a government that boasts of being close to business, but its actual decisions are hurting business. This lack of predictability is something that we will change. We'll clarify the rules for foreign investments. We'll welcome investments. We'll welcome trade as long as it's reciprocal, as long as it's responsible, and as long as it's fair.
Here, here.
La partie qui nous préoccupe le plus, Monsieur le Président, et c'est une tendance lourde depuis 2009, c'est cette tendance à éviscérer tout ce qui est protection environnementale au Canada. Le gouvernement est allé même jusqu'à enlever, en 2009, les premiers balbutiements de ça, c'était la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables. Moi, je me souviens, le ministre des Affaires extérieures, qui a dit que c'était, et je le cite en anglais, il l'a dit en anglais, « the greatest job killer ». On était perplexes, on s'est dit, c'est pas possible à cette époque d'opposer environnement et économie, comme si on n'avait pas appris depuis 50 ans de faire travailler les deux ensemble, parce que les deux doivent progresser ensemble. Voilà. Je me souviens d'avoir été bouche bée en commission parlementaire, alors que j'ai vu le Parti libéral voter avec les conservateurs pour une première fois pour commencer à démanteler la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables. C'était en 2009. Ça a continué en 2010. Ça a continué en 2011 avec ce qu'on est en train de voir ici. Ils sont en train de fermer à double tour cette protection si cruciale pour nous, pour tout le monde. Et vous savez quoi? Ce sont les entreprises elles-mêmes qui souhaitent de la prévisibilité dans toutes ces aventures-là. Ils ne veulent pas qu'on arrive à la fin pour leur dire qu'ils n'ont pas respecté. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on voit à la place? Au lieu d'appliquer les lois fédérales de protection de l'environnement, comme la loi sur les pêches, la loi sur la protection des espèces menacées, la loi sur les oiseaux migrateurs, et ainsi de suite, qu'est-ce qu'on voit? Eux, ils sont en train de les éventrer, de les dénaturer. C'est intéressant parce qu'on sait qu'il y a des procédures, des processus, des façons de faire, notamment dans les sables bitumineux, où le fédéral n'applique plus ces lois. Ce défaut d'application, normalement, va conduire à plus de dégradation des écosystèmes. C'est un gouvernement qui se dit de loi et d'ordre. Alors, normalement, quand tu as une compagnie qui a des pratiques non conformes à la loi, tu vas forcer la compagnie de changer ses pratiques.
Exactement.
Eux, ils vont changer la loi pour le rendre conforme aux pratiques. Vous savez, la loi sur la protection des eaux navigables dont on parlait tout à l'heure, mais je vais vous donner un exemple concret. Au Canada, il y a 27 seulement il y a 37 rivières qui sont des rivières du patrimoine. Il y en a 27 des 37 qui ne sont plus protégées. 27 of Canada's 37 designated heritage rivers will no longer be protected. They include the Blood Vein, Manitoba, Ontario, the Cowichan in BC, Clearwater, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Maine and Newfoundland, Labrador, Margaree in Nova Scotia, South Nahanni, Northwest Territories, Tachahini in Yukon, Mattawa in Ontario, and the Upper Restigouche in New Brunswick. And just for no, not Mr. Speaker, I actually enjoy responding to the peanut gallery when they heckle, because the question is it navigable? Duh. Yes. It's a definition in the law. No amount of rebranding will take away from the fact that the Navigable Waters Protection Act was meant to ensure sustainable development for future generations. I mentioned in my opening remarks the decision of Judge Lemaire in the Old Man River case. Let me read you one section. This is from Justice Lemaire. The Minister of Transport, in his capacity of decision-maker under the Navigable Waters Protection Act, must thus consider the environmental impact of the dam on such issues of federal jurisdiction as navigable waters, fisheries, Indians, and Indian lands. And after that, they stand up and say that that law had nothing to do with the environment. Shame. Shame. Shame on it. It's Orwellian. They made their website disappear after a question was asked by my colleague from Halifax yesterday. 29 references to the environment, they made them disappear. They want to make the environment disappear. We're going to stand up and protect the environment for now and for future generations. to continue to fight their omnibus budget bills. Because there are two different aspects that are being discussed today. When we look at the contents of what they're proposing, we get the results that we're looking at here. We're hurting people. We're taking away programs. We're taking away protections that we've given in Canada for generations. But before we even look at those, there's an aspect that all Canadians have to consider in what we're going through today, which is the continuation of what the Conservatives started in the spring. This type of omnibus budget bill, ominous budget bill, is affecting dozens and dozens of different laws. We've fallen into the American trap of avoiding our parliamentary debate. Our system is different from the American budget system, where you tack on and you tack on and you tack on. Right. The Conservatives, we remember the Prime Minister's telling us, it's not something that we've said, he admitted that he never watches Canadian television. He never watches the Canadian news. He gets all his news from Fox. So I guess it's not surprising that he thinks that the American system applies here, and he's simply given instructions to his House Leader, to his other officers, to start following the American system of using a budget bill as sort of a catch-all, where you just throw in all the stuff that you want to change. And that's what we've got again here. That's an undermining of our parliamentary democracy.
Right. Exactly.
Those are our institutions. They're not only taking away things like Medicare, free, universal, public medical care, putting that in danger, because the cuts that I referred to earlier, the $36 billion that they announced without discussion or debate, that will lead inexorably to a two-tier system. That's just a fancy way of saying that poor people are going to have trouble seeing a doctor and rich people will have access because they'll be able to pay for it. That's not the Canadian system. That's not the Canadian way. We will stand up and fight them. Oui, à chaque étape. Nous allons nous tenir debout parce que pour la première fois depuis très longtemps, on commence à avoir de l'espoir. La prochaine campagne va opposer deux visions pour notre pays. Une vision conservatrice, où on sabre dans les protections sociales. On enlève 10 milliards de dollars par année. C'est le chiffre qu'ils ont essayé de cacher. Le chat est sorti du sac hier. J'ai entendu la députée de Saint-Boniface tout à l'heure dire « Ah, vous savez, on a donné des séances d'information qui ont duré très longtemps. » Laissez-moi vous parler de la séance d'information budgétaire. Parce que j'étais le porte-parole en matière de finances pour l'opposition officielle pendant 5 budgets avant de devenir chef de l'opposition officielle. Et j'ai jamais vu ce que j'ai vu le printemps dernier. À chaque année, puis c'est souvent les mêmes personnes qu'on voit d'année en année. D'habitude, ils sont dans leur bureau. On a très peu de raisons de les voir ici, sauf de rares fois en commission parlementaire. Les officiers sont là pour nous fournir de l'information. Quand j'ai vu non seulement la coupure dans le budget, les 2 ans de plus dans le budget, je suis allé les voir pour leur demander un seul chiffre, facile à fournir. Combien, à terme, va représenter cet ajout de 2 ans de travail de plus et combien on va être en train de piger dans les poches des personnes âgées? J'ai eu la réponse suivante, je la donne dans la version originale. I can't give you that information. Alors moi, je suis capable de décoder une demi-vérité quand je l'entends. Alors, j'ai dit, are you telling me you can't give me that information because you don't have it? Or are you telling me you have that information but you can't give it to me? Ce à quoi j'ai eu une réponse digne de George Orwell. I can't give you that information.
C'est quoi ça?
C'est ça, les conservateurs. Hier, le vérificateur général a confirmé le chiffre global parce que ça lui avait été posé en conférence de presse au ministre des Finances, juste ici devant, il y a quelques mois. Nous, on avait calculé entre 10 et 12 milliards, on n'était pas loin. Eux, ils calculent 10 milliards. Mais il refusait de donner le chiffre. Il a répondu avec son sourire habituel, d'un air de dire « Regarde, je m'en sac ». Il a dit « J'ai entendu des chiffres à peu près comme ça ». C'est quelque chose, ça, un ministre des Finances qui dit des choses comme ça. Alors, je peux vous dire une chose, et je peux le dire aux aînés qui nous écoutent. Soyez assurés que les 2 ans ajoutés, vos 2 ans conservateurs, oubliez ça. Un gouvernement NPD va restaurer les 65 ans. On va se tenir debout. On va se tenir debout, nous. Contrairement à tous ceux qui sont obligés de faire le perroquet tous les jours, de lire les lignes qui leur sont écrites par le bureau du Premier ministre. Ils ont parfois 1 minute par jour dans leur pauvre petite vie parlementaire pour parler enfin de leur circonscription, pour parler enfin des vraies choses. Et qu'est-ce qu'ils font? Ils font le perroquet, des marionnettes, des pantins, pantagruelles. Ça se lève puis ça nous dit exactement ce que le bureau du Premier ministre a décidé de leur dire de dire. Nous, on est capable, nous, d'être raisonnables. Nous, on est capable, nous, de se tenir debout et regarder les faits objectifs. Nous, on est capable, nous, de regarder le public et de leur dire que ça soit pour les pensions de retraite, pour l'intégrité de notre Parlement, pour notre système de santé universel, gratuit et public, on est fiers de se tenir debout. On va se tenir debout pour l'environnement. Parce que nous, au NPD, on sait qu'on mérite mieux que ce que les conservateurs nous offrent depuis 6 ans. Oui. Depuis qu'ils sont arrivés au pouvoir, les conservateurs multiplient les occasions pour inventer des titres qui disent exactement le contraire du contenu du projet de loi. J'ai eu l'occasion de dire la semaine dernière, quand il était question de cette plus récente mouture d'une loi Mammouth, que si par aventure, ils faisaient enfin ce qu'ils avaient promis de faire lors de la dernière campagne électorale, c'est-à-dire s'occuper de la création d'emplois, que bien sûr, on voterait pour le projet de loi. Pendant les remarques que j'ai faites aujourd'hui, je vous ai bien intimé, Monsieur le Président, qu'il y avait des choses dans ce projet de loi-là, et on était capable de le dire, avec lesquelles on pourrait faire une bonne discussion si on était capable de porter scission du projet de loi, et en scindant le projet de loi, en l'amenant devant des commissions différentes, on pourrait y arriver. Parce que nous, on croit qu'effectivement, qu'il y a des choses qui peuvent et doivent être faites. J'ai donné une indication tout à l'heure lorsque je parlais de crédit d'impôt pour la création d'emplois. Mais c'est la manière de le faire. Mais on ne les laisserait pas nous berner. On est trop habitués à leurs fausses promesses. Alors, de notre côté, on est en train de leur dire clairement que s'ils veulent porter scission du projet de loi, s'ils veulent diviser le projet de loi dans des parties congrues qui seront faciles à étudier, bien, ils vont trouver quelqu'un qui est prêt à collaborer. Alors, on va voir. On va faire le test de la capacité des conservateurs, encore une fois, de faire des choses qui sont conformes à ce qu'ils disent. Parce qu'on a vu pour la loi sur la protection des zones navigables que ce qu'ils disent, c'est une chose, la vérité des documents, c'est une autre. Alors, voici quelques éléments du projet de loi qui pourraient être scindés. Et je vais me permettre une petite énumération. Here are some of the elements of C-45 that could be split off from the bill and studied separately and properly in parliamentary committee. And they've already shown that it's possible because we did it last week. And by the way, I open a little parenthesis just to say that there are 450,000 public servants in Canada who are very happy that the NDP actually read what the Liberals were putting in. Because such is the Liberal incompetence that they were about to give 1-2-3 agreement to the enactment of a law that would have taken MPs and senators' pensions and dealt with it on the same footing as the pensions of 450,000 civil servants. Yep. The NDP stood up, demanded a change, and was able to get it done right. It was so pathetic to see the House Leader for the Liberals standing in the hallway and stuttering away saying, oh, well, it was a spelling mistake. It was a typographical error. One of his classics. 450,000 people are a typographical error for the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. So here are some of the elements that can be split off from the bill. The gutting of the Canada Environmental Assessment Act should be before the Environment Committee. The gutting of the Navigable Waters Protection Act should be before Environment and Transportation. The elimination of the Hazardous Materials Information Review Commission should, of course, go to Health. Cutting to the SHRED tax credits should go to Industry. Changes to the Fisheries Act should go to Fisheries and Oceans. Changes to the Indian Act should go to Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. Changes to the New Bridges to Strength Trade Act is to transportation. Eliminating the Grain Act tribunals should go to agriculture. Pension reform should go to human resources, skills, and social development. Mr. Speaker, therefore, I would like to seek unanimous consent, and I'm sure it's going to be given.
I hear yes.
They say no before they even hear it. It sounds like conservative.
I heard yes.
To move the following motion. That notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House, that Bill C-45, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29, 2012, and other measures be amended by removing the following clauses. A. Clauses 9, 27, 28, and 62 to 64 related to the scientific research and experimental development tax credit. B. Clauses 173 to 178 related to the Fisheries Act. C. Clauses 179 to 184 related to the proposed Bridge to Strengthen Trade Act. D. Clauses 206 to 209 related to the Indian Act. E. Clauses 210 to 218 related to the Judges Act. F. Clauses 264 to 268 related to the Customs Act. G. Clauses 269 to 298 related to the Hazardous Materials Information Review Act. I. Clauses 316 to 350 related to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. J. Clauses 351 to 410 related to the Canada Grains Act. K. Clauses 425 to 432 related to the Canada Environmental Assessment Act. And L. Clauses 464 to 514 related to pension reforms. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section A de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-47, que le projet de loi C-47 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent de l'industrie, des sciences et de la technologie. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section B de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-48, que les projets de loi C-48 soient réputés avoir été lus une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent des pêches et des océans. Excellent. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section C de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-49, que le projet de loi C-49 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent des transports, de l'infrastructure et des collectivités. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section D de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-50 et que le projet de loi C-50 soit réputé avoir lieu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent des affaires autochtones et du développement du Grand Nord. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section E de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-51, que le projet de loi C-51 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent de la justice et des droits de la personne. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section F de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-52, que le projet de loi C-52 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent de la sécurité.
Order, if I could interrupt the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. If he could slow down, the translators are having a difficult time. He will have the opportunity to complete reading his motion. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Que les articles mentionnés dans la section G de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-53, que le projet de loi C-53 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent de la santé, que les articles mentionnés dans la section H de cette motion forment le projet de loi C-54, que le projet de loi C-54 soit réputé avoir été lu une première fois et que l'impression en soit ordonnée, que l'ordre portant en deuxième lecture du dit projet de loi en prévoit le renvoi au Comité permanent de la citoyenneté et de l'immigration. That the clauses mentioned in section I and K of this motion do compose Bill C-55, that Bill C-55 be deemed read a first time and be printed, that the order for second reading of the said bill provide for the referral to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development, that the clauses mentioned in section J of this motion do compose Bill C-56, that Bill C-56 be deemed read a first time and be printed, that the order for second reading of the said bill provide for the referral to the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, and that the clauses mentioned in section L of this motion do compose Bill C-57, that Bill C-57 be deemed read a first time and be printed, that the order for second reading of said bill provide for the referral to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. That Bill C-45 retain the status of the order paper that it had prior to the adoption of this order.
That's helpful.
That Bill C-45 be reprinted as amended, and that the law clerk and parliamentary council be authorized to make any technical changes or corrections as may be necessary to give effect to this motion. Mr. Speaker, we are proposing this motion in order to better study individually in the appropriate parliamentary committee this omnibus budget bill that touches dozens of different pieces of legislation. We find that it is in the interest of this parliamentary institution that has been so hard-pressed by a Conservative majority that thinks it can run roughshod over the rights of Parliament.
Here, here.